evening. Welcome everyone to Thales College and to the first lecture of 4 in this year's Sydney and Cecile Smith Lectures on Virtue. We started this lecture series just last spring, so 24-25 will be our first academic year where we have a full spate of lectures. We're going to have 2 in the fall and then 2 in the spring. Our next lecture in the series will be in November, and we will be given by Dr. Catherine Pakaluk, Professor of Economics at Catholic University of America. Dr. Pakaluk will be speaking on the virtue of gratitude, particularly gratitude for the gift of children, which relates to some of her academic work on large families. That will be Thursday, the week before Thanksgiving, so literally exactly a week before Thanksgiving, so a very easy date to remember. I think it's going to be awesome. I'm really excited about it. So hopefully many of you will return for that, and please be on the lookout in your inboxes for email in the coming weeks with further information. I want to say a special thank you to 2 individuals who couldn't be here tonight. First, the founder of Thales College, Mr. Robert Luddy, and second, Miss Christine Smith, whose generous donation in honor of her parents has made this lecture series possible. Fortunately, we'll be video recording tonight's talk and uploading it to YouTube or, I don't know, somewhere on the internet, so anyone who's missed it tonight can watch it later. And finally, it is my pleasure and privilege to welcome our lecturer this evening, Dr. Ryan Olson, research professor at the University of Virginia and senior fellow at UVA's Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture. Until stepping down very recently, Dr. Olson was for 8 years the director of the IACS under the executive leadership of world-renowned sociologist James Davison Hunter. A classicist, Olson's scholarship has focused on the literary, historical, religious, and cultural context of the Levant from the Roman era through late antiquity. I think we'll be hearing about that tonight. Before coming to UVA, Olson previously served as program director at the Kern Family Foundation, a leading U.S. Philanthropy concerned with educational reform, and founding program director of the Character and Education Program. His work in educational reform began with teaching English composition to at-risk college students and leading an education policy program at a state-based think tank. Dr. Olson lives in Charlottesville with his wife and 3 kids. The Smith Lectures on Virtue is an annual lecture series at Thales College that aims to explore different themes and facets of virtue, always with an eye towards application, applying what we've learned to our lives and to our own times, our own cultural context in 21st century America. Dr. Olson's talk is titled, Right Where You Left Me, Choosing Virtuous Traditions Again, Ancient Insights from Josephus. Dr. Olson.
Good evening. Thank you. Are you asleep already? Good evening. Okay, good to hear from you. Look forward to hearing from you more later. Peter, thank you very much for that kind introduction and for your hospitality, and Maria for putting together a great event. Very grateful to be here again. I was at the college last year, so it's been great to see the growth and meet students. Thanks also to Christine Smith for giving the gift to support this lecture series in honor of her parents. And I'd like to thank Mr. Leddy, who's not here, but for this invitation to give the Smith Lecture this year. It's an honor, and I'm grateful for his friendship and the inspiring example that he has provided all of us, not to mention the extraordinary boost that he is giving to classical education in our time, which is greatly needed. And we do some work in that area, and so it's been great, having known him for several years, to see the effects of his institution building around the country, and not just in this region. We need more institutions than the school in our moral ecosystems, though, and so that's what I'd like to talk about tonight. There's a handout in your folder. I think it's on the left side. And so I'll refer to that a little bit. There are a couple of texts there that we'll read together and talk about. You don't need it just yet. But I was trained, as Peter said, as a classicist and a Roman historian. But I've spent the last 15 years or so in education policy and philanthropy and university administration and nonprofit leadership and fundraising, and have now finally been able to return to scholarship as a research professor at UVA and a senior fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture. But it's been a long transition, and so what I'm sharing tonight is original work that I've just begun developing for a major, and that'll probably turn into a major project. So, and when I picked the theme, I don't know how many of you recognize the title, the quotation. Anyone recognize the title? Okay. Well, when I picked the theme, I grabbed the title of a Taylor Swift song because I just read an article by a leading Shakespeare scholar who favorably compared Taylor Swift to the Bard. And so I was looking at some of her songs, and my youngest daughter said, whoa, Dad, that's very hip. And so she and my niece wholeheartedly approved of the title choice. I chose it, though, before a major presidential candidate tweeted that he hated Taylor Swift, and she reportedly said she regretted her election endorsement. And I honestly don't care about any of that right now. I just want to talk about her song, Right Where You Left Me. And this poem is about a young woman whose boyfriend broke off their relationship while sitting in a restaurant. And the young woman has stayed at the restaurant emotionally and relationally, waiting for him to return, even though she muses he probably got married and moved on with his life. And so she waits. It's a very sad song, but the videos on YouTube always show Swifties singing along enthusiastically. It's really extraordinary. Anybody been to a Taylor Swift concert? No? Okay. If you ever think you got it wrong, the song goes, I'm right where you left me. You left me no choice but to stay here forever. This got me thinking about the traditions that we're raised in and our tendency to leave them. The Hebrew prophets would often talk about this dynamic in terms of a love relationship. It's about faithfulness, infidelity, loving pursuit, and so on. As a father of 3 teenagers, being raised in a situation where we've tried to align our home and our religious congregation and our school into a kind of greenhouse, I have to say I worry that the endless choices my kids have coming at them from every device and desire imaginable will drag them away from the character that we're striving to form in them and from the virtuous tradition that's forming them now. And it's not just me and my wife who worry about that. That would be a bit self-indulgent to give a lecture about that. Research shows that other parents are concerned about this as well. One major study of the transmission of religion provides telling clues. The study was on religious traditions, but many metaphysical and philosophical systems could be included in this kind of idea. Among parents who say religion is very important, 63% worry about their children maintaining their religious tradition, the one they are being raised in. And among those who attend religious events once a week, it's 63%, and more than once a week, it's 69%. Among all parents, it's 53%. Other research finds they're right to be worried. A study by Christian Smith at Notre Dame found that the true, tacit, functional, de facto religion of the vast majority of American teenagers is not a specific philosophy or religious creed, but instead is one that has been dubbed by Chris Smith moralistic therapeutic deism, MTD. And what is MTD? Here are the 5 tenets. Number 1, a God exists who created and ordered the world and watches over human life on earth. Number 2, God wants people to be good, nice, and fair to each other. Number 3, the central goal of life is to be happy and to feel good about oneself. Number 4, God does not need to be particularly involved in one's life, except when God is needed to resolve a problem. And number 5, good people go to heaven when they die. And teens hold this, the researchers argue, because it's what they see their parents articulate and practice, even if they're supposedly being raised in a specific religious tradition. It's a species of what Robert Bellah called expressive individualism. The Catholic philosopher Charles Taylor has argued that there are 3 types of secularity: the subtraction of religion from the public square, the decline in religious identity and practice, and the cultural conditions in which it is possible not to believe in God. In 1500, not to believe in God would have been all but unimaginable. but now simply accepting the tradition that was handed down in one's family is out of the question. We are now in a social world where we must choose our beliefs and ways of living. Now, in myriad ways, the world is better off in 2024 than it was in 1500, thanks to the extraordinary benefits of modernity, like markets, science and technology, medicine, and the like, fostered not least by the spread of human liberty. But a growing number today lament that freedom has gone too far, that modernity has sown the seeds of its own destruction. So now we have endless consumer choices, but we often find it difficult to choose to affirm basic metaphysical truths, what we believe in and why, in areas of life beyond perhaps politics. And then having resolved to believe and develop the habits of life, late moderns often struggle to persist throughout their lives because of the ups and downs human beings inevitably face. A wise teacher once told me to explore history, especially ancient history, for perspective when the contemporary world doesn't make sense. Human nature being constant, history is a tremendous teacher. No doubt that partially explains the growth of the classical education movement that we see here. When we talk about education in antiquity or classical education, we usually discuss the writings of Aristotle, Plato, Augustine, or we analyze the use that Dorothy L. Sayers or C.S. Lewis made of classical figures and ideas. And these are terrific avenues from which I've learned much. But never have I been to a classical education lecture or a lecture on virtue about Flavius Josephus. So I thought I'd give one. Josephus was born in AD 37 and died sometime after 100. So, first century. Not talking about Josephus when we think about ancient formation is strange. I say this because Josephus lived in a cosmopolitan Roman world that had a far wider array of religious and philosophical diversity than is often appreciated, including Greek and Roman philosophies and religions, as well as great variety within such philosophies and religions. We have begun to understand the varieties of Judaism in particular far more than we could have imagined just a few decades ago, and we'll look at that in a moment. Josephus is interesting to consider on questions of ancient education and formation also because he wrote several paragraphs about his own education, which is unique in antiquity. These passages can be found in his 20-book history of the Judean world, the Jewish Antiquities, which begins at creation and goes through about 66. So he uses the Hebrew scriptures and then covers what's now called the intertestamental period. As well then as his penultimate work, his autobiography, which was a kind of memoir about his political career, and it was a sort of appendix to the Jewish antiquity, Jewish antiquities. Then his last work, which was later titled Against Apion, which is a kind of apologetic work, contained a long passage on what distinguished the Jewish tradition from the Persian, Egyptian, and Greek traditions, all supposedly ancient and therefore prestigious civilizations. One of the distinctives, Josephus says, was the Jewish system of formation or education, and its superiority was demonstrated by its results, namely that the Jews lived in harmony with one another and agreed with one another. So what did Josephus say? And now I'm going to refer to the handout, only the English. Didn't have time to cut the Greek off, sorry. So on the right-hand side of the page, Jewish Antiquities, I'm going to start about in the center, the middle of that big block of text. And now I take, so I'm just going to read this and then we'll talk about it. And now I take heart from the consummation of my proposed work, so he's wrapping it up here, Book 20, to assert that no one else, either Jew or Gentile, would have been equal to the task. Humility was not one of his virtues. However willing to undertake it, of issuing so accurate a treatise as this for the Greek world. For my compatriots admit that in Jewish learning, I far excel them. I have also labored strenuously to partake of the realm of Greek prose and poetry, after having gained a knowledge of Greek grammar, although the habitual use of my native tongue has prevented my attaining precision in the pronunciation. And then I'm going to skip to the next work, which is his autobiography, The Life, the Vita, and I'll start at the 2, or the 2 in parentheses. Distinguished as he was by his noble birth, my father Matthias was even more esteemed for his upright character, being among the most notable men in Jerusalem, our greatest city. Brought up with Matthias, my own brother, by both parents, I made great progress in my education, gaining a reputation for an excellent memory and understanding. While still a mere boy, about 14 years old, I won universal applause for my love of letters, insomuch that the chief priests and the leading men of the city used constantly to come to me for precise information on some particular in our ordinances in the law, the Jewish law. At about the age of 16, I determined to gain personal experience of the several sects into which our nation is divided. These, as I have frequently mentioned, are 3 in number, the first that of the Pharisees, the second of the Sadducees, and the third that of the Essenes. I thought that after a thorough investigation, I should be in a position to select the best. So I submitted myself to hard training and laborious exercises and passed through the 3 courses. Not content, however, with the experience thus gained, on hearing of one named Bannus, who dwelt in the wilderness, wearing only such clothing as trees provided, feeding on such things as grew of themselves, and using frequent ablutions of cold water by day and night for purity's sake, I became his devoted disciple. With him I lived for 3 years, and having accomplished my purpose, returned to the city. Being now in my 19th year, I began to govern my life by the rules of the Pharisees, a sect having points of resemblance to that which the Greeks call the Stoic school. Now, the educational profile that Josephus provides here on his LinkedIn page has been interpreted by some scholars as obviously Jewish, and by others as patently classical. He was educated in 3 distinctive Jewish sects, and was sought after at a precocious age, he says, to interpret the Jewish law, which was the focus, the center of education in Judea. On the other hand, he is a lover of knowledge, learned Greek, exercised his memory. He followed the tradition of the Greek philosophers by using his youth to explore ideas and then settled down with the one that he found to be best. Each interpretation, the Jewish and the classical, seems implausible to the other set of scholars. It's kind of interesting. So I will argue that Josephus saw no conflict between these 2 profiles, as his modern interpreters do, and indeed his point was to define an alternative for the Jewish ruling class after AD 70, and it was in AD 70 that the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. I'll talk about that. So that the Judeans could flourish under Roman domination, perhaps to try again to prove the legitimacy of the Judean ruling class, that they could be relied on to govern Judea post-rebellion. What was needed was the particularity of tradition with wise leadership that engages with the pluralistic world without losing traditional distinctives. And at our institute, we argue that this is the case whether the tradition is religious or philosophical or pedagogical. So, let's look at the evidence. The evidence of Josephus' education is primarily found in the Vita, in those sections we looked at, and also in a work called Against Appian, which I didn't give you, but I'll talk about. Josephus states that he made great progress in his education and mentions his memory, a very important part of a Greek education, his quick comprehension, the plaudits he received for his love of books, and his regular consultation with the chief priests and civic leaders on precise points of law. All of this while he was 14 years old, Josephus claims. Around the age of 16, Josephus says he decided to take a test drive of the 3 Judean sects, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes, so that he could select which one was the best. In addition to these schools, he became the follower of an ascetic in the Judean wilderness for some 3 years, before choosing Pharisaism as his way of life as a citizen. The second piece of evidence that you don't have of his education occurs in this work, the Against Apion, which provides an account of education generally, as Josephus must have experienced it, especially in relation to the pedagogical traditions of other societies. Josephus, this is really interesting. For those of you who study these things, if you're not familiar with this, you might find this interesting. Josephus identifies two categories of education and instruction: precept and practice. Precept, logos, and the practical exercise of one's character, ethos. Philosophical schools tend to emphasize one or the other, he argues, but Judea's lawgiver, Moses, combined both, requiring both learning and the practice of the law. The means of instruction in the law for men was to be weekly, Josephus says, and in place of regular work. So the Jews actually knew what they believed, essentially, is what he's arguing, and they lived it. The goal was to gather together with others to hear and to thoroughly and precisely learn the law. Josephus' account has elements easily recognizable to scholars of religion and of classics. To classicists, the emphases on loving knowledge, excellent grammar, precision, and exploring various philosophical schools are familiar stuff. To the scholar of Judaism, identifying the schools of the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes, apprenticing oneself to a master, excelling at the study of the law, and practical knowledge. All of this seems obviously Judean, so which is it? One possibility is that he's pandering to both sides. To his Roman audience, he appears to have had an adequate education in the tradition of paideia, or humanitas, and that's the word he uses when he says, I excelled in my education, my paideia. And this is a very significant word, as some of you will know. Early formation in the Greek and Roman worlds occurred primarily in the household. Literate and numerate education for a public career drew from a classical canon aimed at humanitas, or paideia. Education from the most rudimentary forms to the highest levels of the ethical schools aimed to shape the body and the soul, the whole person, as we might say today, for full participation in the life of one's household, religion, and political community. Institutions and their leaders were eager to pass on their social and intellectual nature by exercising the qualities through which they created it. The philosopher Werner Jaeger aptly noted, and aligning those institutions and messages, despite philosophical differences, was a preoccupation across the socioeconomic spectrum, as recently uncovered evidence of popular Roman morality has shown. The formation of children and of civic leaders necessarily reflected these realities. Quoting Jaeger again, education is not a practice which concerns the individual alone. It is essentially a function of the community. The character of the community is expressed in the individuals who compose it, and the community is the source of all behavior, to such an extent that, according to Jaeger's deeply learned account, the Greek mind owes its superior strength to the fact that it was deeply rooted in the life of the community. Greek education, like its ancient successors, reflected the inescapable belief that human beings are essentially of the polis, political, although that word means government today. And the goal of that education was to create a supra-personal life in the image of the community rather than a perfect independent personality. As such, education began not with the individual, but with humanitas, the ideal of genuine human nature. So when Josephus refers to his education, he uses this word, paideia, which would have conjured these connotations for his Roman and Greek readers. We lose those connotations today, so I wanted to kind of fill that out. And to any Judeans who may read his history, he appears to have been raised in the traditions that they will have recognized and respected. But if he's writing to Romans, why does he emphasize traditions that are quite provincial, ones about which his Roman readers would not only have been ignorant, but to which they would not have in the slightest been sympathetic, much less impressed? Certainly, Josephus is proving his status to both, status being important perennially, but especially when navigating the boundaries of inclusion and exclusion. claiming his formative lineage within the Paideia tradition would have signaled Josephus' legitimacy as a member of the Roman elite. To quote one Roman historian, the traditional elite of the Roman Empire, especially the group of born senators, regarded Paideia as an essential asset of any elite member of society. Paideia connected the members of the senatorial elite to each other and guaranteed cultural homogeneity between them, defining the upper class status group. Anyone who lacked the appropriate Paideia was considered inferior by the senatorial elite. Why then mention and elaborate upon his provincial formation? He's mentioned the one, why the other? Josephus' narrative reflects the education of the ruling class under Rome. Earlier methods of elite formation reflected in the Hebrew Bible had been Hellenized, made Greek, but we have no reason to believe that the educational traditions from the Hebrew Bible hadn't persisted. In the scriptures, formation was based in a family that meted out caring discipline and helped children to control the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, and allowed children's natural abilities to develop, from which vocational training in agriculture, artisanship, or the trades could ensue. Religious education also featured prominently, of course, as did celebrating the Passover and other holidays on the Hebrew calendar. Beyond this basic instruction, priests like Josephus was a priest, would have been highly literate so they could supervise the copying of the Torah and teach it. They would also have been trained in rendering decisions about the laws of ritual purity, performing sacrificial rites, and supervising finances. So they had some accounting skills for those who teach accounting in the room. Schools for the training of priests were likely located within the temple complex, and the process was prolonged. Priests were not counted as such in the census until age 30, which likely means they undertook a long period of apprenticeship. This education would have been conducted largely in the language of the scriptures and the liturgy, Hebrew, but by the 3rd century BC, when the Hebrew Bible had been translated into Greek, and Greek had become the dominant language of the Eastern Mediterranean, training in the Greek language and literature would have been more common. Josephus' education in the middle of the 1st century AD would have been conducted in Greek, in part as education would have been throughout the Roman Near East. As a priest, Josephus was part of the class of Judeans that had been identified by Augustus, the first Roman emperor, in 6 AD to hold power locally under the authority of the emperor, represented by a procurator, a kind of junior governor. The Roman state was not a massive bureaucracy, nor was the Roman army omnipresent. Rather, the Roman legions were stationed on the frontiers of Roman territory. The closest legions to Judea were in Syria, and those 3 legions were under the command of a provincial governor, a senior one, who reported to the emperor directly. Auxiliary troops stationed in Jerusalem near the temple under the command of the procurator were used to keep the peace, especially during Passover pilgrimages to the temple that would bring Jews from all over the empire. Upon the accession of Augustus and his agreement with a certain Idumean client king named Herod, Judea had been under the control of Herod and his court, but this had changed upon Herod's death in 4 BC. He basically killed off the first round of sons and then was left with the B team. And the one who ended up with the job didn't do so well. And so Augustus intervened. That's the Cliff's Notes version. After Herod had not been able to identify a worthy successor. So without a client king during most of this period, Augustus had to decide whom to give power to so that the province could be adequately controlled. While when Rome made those decisions, they were based on Roman criteria. And legitimacy was determined by standards that would have been recognized as prestigious among Roman elites, not a provincial populace. And in Rome, social status was tied largely to wealth, among a few other factors, like being from an old family. In Judea, social status was not tied to wealth, but instead to religion. And so priests had high status. But priests who were wealthy enjoyed no more legitimacy or standing among the Jews than priests who were poor. So that was a problem for Rome. Josephus in his histories frequently refers to the leading men or Jerusalem council, but there was no recognized group like this. It didn't exist. The populace was nearly impossible for the so-called ruling class of Judea to control. Further complicating the situation was that the fact that Judaism was not monolithic during this period. Instead, there were several factions. Josephus typically mentions three, as we saw in our reading: Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes. And we know these were not the only sects, however, because Josephus often mentions these three on his way to talk about a fourth, which he called the fourth philosophy. And recall also that he mentioned the wilderness teacher he apprenticed himself to for 3 years, who may have been an Essene. There are similarities, but Josephus never identifies him this way, so he probably represented another kind of Judean group. And through Josephus' older contemporary, Philo of Alexandria, we know about a group called the extreme allegorists, who interpreted the law allegorically. And then, if you've heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are the Dead Sea sectarians in Qumran, who were a distinctive community. In any case, there may have been more than a dozen types. And this is one of the benefits of the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered just 70 years ago. Discovering one or more types of Judaism we never knew about has made us aware that there may indeed have been others. And just as a quick aside, as I'm getting back into this research after several years, DNA analysis on the Dead Sea Scrolls is revealing that the scrolls that use leather often came from the same sheep or goat herds. Isn't that interesting? This seems to be the case for the community scrolls, the ones that governed the life of the community that lived there in Qumran. But other scrolls use leather from different herds, which then allows us to see the extent to which these documents originated elsewhere, were brought to Qumran and deposited into a library in the caves there. How they were used, hard to say. But that all points to greater religious variety than what we'd originally known. So the DNA evidence supports the textual evidence. Doesn't always happen that way. Now, what united varieties of Judaism, according to Josephus, was the temple. The temple was originally built by Israel's third king, Solomon, David's son, then rebuilt by Ezra after the return from exile, and then expanded significantly by Herod the Great, and became, in a sense, the economic engine of Judea. The irony was that when Josephus was writing about the temple unifying all Jews, you remember what year I said it was destroyed? 70. Josephus is writing in 90s. The temple had been destroyed, razed more than 2 decades previously. He wrote as if he expected it to be rebuilt, or at least we could say that he doesn't appear to assume that it won't be rebuilt. So, question, how was the temple destroyed? Answer, by Roman legions, who probably didn't mean to do so. They were sacking Jerusalem in the 4th year of Rome's war with Judea, which had begun in 66 AD. Why? In his histories, Josephus lays the blame for the war on the lower classes. The ruling class, which had been identified by the Roman state to keep the province in line, as we said, never was able to manage the province. They had been chosen because they were wealthy, which ultimately did little to enhance the ruling class's legitimacy in the eyes of the populace. Josephus and his predecessors and friends were elites because Rome had decided they would function as elites. But when internal dissensions and tensions heightened, there was practically nothing the so-called leadership class could do. To a Roman audience, then, that had around them in the city of Rome the symbols of the Roman conquest of Judea, if you've been to Rome, for example, and seen the Arch of Titus, or seen pictures of it with, you can see the menorah and implements from the temple that were paraded through Rome in a triumph. that Vespasian gave. That's another story. Or there were coins minted that said Judea capta, sort of propaganda about the Roman conquest of Judea. A Roman audience would have been familiar with this. And so Josephus' text offered an explanation as to why the Romans conquered. The people refused to be ruled. It wasn't the fault of the ruling class. The ruling class had been formed like any other provincial elite under a Greek and Roman education system of paideia, learning Greek, reading Greek prose and poetry, writing history according to the Greco-Roman method. Hence, Josephus is, in his discussion of education, is signaling his elite status, which would serve to excuse elites for the rebellion. This becomes even clearer when Josephus says in section 12 of the Life, the one that you have, that after he had explored the four options he describes, Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, and Bannus, he chose the Pharisees. The Thackeray translation that you have renders that I began to govern my life, like it was his personal choice to live by this ethic, by the rules of the Pharisees. The word there is actually a political or civic word, politeuesthai, which is where we get our word politics, polit, you can see it there, or that which is related to the polis, the city, or public life. So we could translate it, I began to govern, or to lead, or at least lead my life as a citizen by living according to the rules of the Pharisees. We know leading as part of the ruling class was an important outcome of Josephus' formation because he follows our section with the story of his first diplomatic trip to Rome to negotiate the release of prisoners, during which time he meets the Emperor Nero's wife and other members of Nero's court. Message: paideia worked. This fits well with the idea that Josephus expounds against Appione, that the Judean system of education is the reason that their society is characterized by harmony. This notion was hugely important in ancient political theory, in ancient education, because it's related to the idea that Aristotle talks about, the virtue of concord. This virtue, Aristotle argued, made a Greek polis like Athens function properly. Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics provides the key text for this virtue of concord, Book 9, Chapter 6. Aristotle defines friendship among citizens as like-mindedness, or concord. Aristotle argues that concord is a species of friendship, which he famously divides into three types according to their bases: utility, pleasure, and virtue. Friends can have a use for one's own advantage. They can derive enjoyment from their association, or at the level of friendship that Aristotle considered to be the deepest, they can relate to one another based on each person's goodness of character or completeness of virtue. Friendships within the context of the Greek city-state or polis are based on advantage or utility, Aristotle argues, to obtain something mutually beneficial. Human relations within the polis derive from, or at least cohere with, Aristotle's theory of virtue, that excellence can be found at the mean between two extremes, which one reaches by habitually choosing the right action for the right reasons at the right time with the right emotions. Aristotle's virtue of concord or harmony is the mean between obsequiousness and bad-temperedness or belligerence. This is a virtue that closely resembles friendship, he says. A civic friendship is one that is not dependent on affection. This means that a civic friend behaves toward those who are known and unknown to her based not on whether she is a friend or an enemy to those whom she encounters, but based rather on who she is, on her character, regardless of whom she meets. The Harvard political philosopher Daniel Allen helpfully names the types at each pole of this virtues continuum: the acquiescent and the domineering. Civic friendship is the midpoint between these two, similar to Hannah Arendt's concept of respect that can even empower forgiveness, and Ralph Ellison's concept of love that serves as the heart of democracy. Aristotle identifies the basic problem in human relations in the polis, and more generally as wanting more than, pleonexia, or rivalrous self-interest, as Daniel Allen calls it. Relating to others frequently leads to conflict arising from divergent desires that cause a rivalry. In a community, this problem manifests itself when people desire to get more than their share of advantages and do less than their share of the labors. In personal friendship, that is manifested when a friend believes he has a right to receive more from his friend because he believes himself to be wealthier, more virtuous, or more useful. Just as in the polis, rivalry leads to discord, so also in personal friendship, rivalrous self-interest leads to a rupture in the friendship. Now, it is just this virtue, this kind of virtue of concord, that Aristotle thinks education, paideia, should form in a citizen to combat the very kind of problem that Judean society had apparently had. Rivalry among factions that led to internal weakness, that led to the destruction of the center of Judaism, the temple. So despite Josephus and his friends' paideia, his province had rebelled because of the rest of the populace. We did everything like we were supposed to, in essence, he's saying. In fact, Pharisaism, Josephus' preferred way of life after exploring all the others, was like Stoicism, he says, which had worked quite effectively as a philosophical framework for governing Rome, and it was very popular in his day. Cicero was a Stoic, Nero was tutored by the Stoic philosopher Seneca, and so on. Josephus is essentially saying, we may use different names, but we do things the same way. We did things the same way, and it didn't succeed. Don't blame us. So of what did Josephus' education consist then? As a Pharisee, his education would have involved learning ancestral customs and inherited practices that were additional to what was written in the Jewish law, as well as broad familiarity with the varieties of Judean religious practice, as well as the paideia that would have been essential for his profession as a politician, a general, and historian, writing in the Greek language, Greek prose and poetry. And the rhetorical skills learned as part of paideia would certainly have contributed to the debate over the Judean ways of life that were held together by the temple and then had to be renegotiated after 70 without the temple, the discipline of those unifying practices. So, what does this trip to first century Judea mean? Josephus, number one, shows us the power of early formation. The habits of mind, behavior, and character he had learned during his youth and his teenage years were the ones he returned to in adulthood and that apparently served him well as he embarked on his public career. He had many choices for how to live his life, as I hope we've seen, and we know from recent research that he had even more choices than he describes in these texts, and he returned to his early formation. In our day, research shows that young people follow what they see and what they themselves practice more than what they hear. So, the importance of early formation. Second, Josephus shows us the relevance of status. Unlike money or power, status is characterized by its rarity and its inexpansibility. You can't share it, and you can't turn it into more. Josephus always seems to be aware of the status issue. He emphasizes his priestly heritage, like the rest of his ruling class friends, but he says he has Hasmonean, royal connections too. He learned the law like many others in his society would have done, since it was the foundation of Jewish education, but he was explaining the fine points of the law to experts when he was 14. And he was one of two or three, he says, who had succeeded in interpreting the meaning of the Jewish scriptures as he had, even writing about it in 20 books. He received paideia, the education of Greek and Roman elites, but he also is unmatched in his ability to write history in the Greco-Roman style, like Thucydides or Polybius, and to live a life of leisurely learning, schole. He went on an embassy to Rome when he was 26 and succeeded at his mission of negotiating the release of prisoners, but he also won for himself Roman citizenship and received the patronage of Roman emperors. I didn't talk about that part of his life. In all of this, he doesn't seem to waver from being religiously observant, not least in circumstances when the Jewish faith was at least temporarily but fundamentally changed by the loss of the temple and the sacrificial system. He also moved from the fringes of the empire, where Judaism was supported by an ecosystem in Judea, to the very heart of that empire. He was now a Jew living in Rome, in the emperor's palace, but that's another story. So we know from modern research that the secret, it seems, is not only to lay the foundation early and well, but also to place young people in status systems that lead to a flourishing life. Hence, Josephus doesn't give up the status system of his religious formation, but he leverages it to succeed in the status system of Rome. In Judean culture, wealth was not a sufficient indication of status and legitimacy. To translate to status, character had to match wealth, which is why Josephus emphasizes his father's noble birth and then immediately says he was even more esteemed for his uprightness of character. In a sense, Josephus succeeded in both societies, and in a sense, he has followed his father's example. A quick modern example. The virtues that are good in and of themselves, honesty, integrity, perseverance, justice, courage, could facilitate success in a career or in life pursuits that are both fulfilling and rewarding from society's perspective. The status systems will conflict at times, and this is where the virtue of practical wisdom, phronesis, or discernment must be taught, which means that young people shouldn't be left to work this out for themselves. They can greatly benefit from guidance to navigate these systems. Studies in the sociology of religion have shown that strong parental religion leads to religious socialization. To quote one study, teenagers with more seriously religious parents are more likely to have been trained in their lives to think, feel, believe, and act as serious religious believers, and that training sticks with them. And again, this applies to philosophical systems as well. So when they wander to figure out the status systems, the tradition will be sitting there, right where they left it, waiting to be taken back up. Third, Josephus cautions us that strong formation is especially important in times of great social upheaval and transformation. Precisely what it meant to be Jewish after the temple had been destroyed wasn't clear. Apparently, life, including religious life, carried on, and there may even have been the expectation that the Romans would allow them to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem, as the Achaemenid ruler Artaxerxes had done during the time of Ezra. But there's no evidence to suggest that Josephus gave up the traditions in which he was raised, even without the temple and its sacrifices, which would have been unimaginable just 50 years earlier. And we can imagine that Josephus thought the formation of leaders was critical because if they were trusted again by the Romans to rebuild Judean society, they would have the status, the education, the paideia, and the skills to do so. And finally, fourth, Josephus embodies the case that wise leadership is irreplaceable. Leaders work out the ideas and the logics, provide examples, teach, and open up the imagination for living a flourishing life, even during, or probably especially during, times of upheaval and social change. Part of the work that I do at the Institute is obviously related to character formation. And to try to create a network of leaders, we've created something called the Moral Ecology Trust. And this is a group of, right now, about 30 senior leaders from across America who've gotten together to say that attending to the ecology of our communities and for the formation of good character and virtuous citizens is important. And so we have the CEO of the Aspen Institute and the president of the National Constitution Center and the director of education for the OECD and a number of other senior leaders, the president of Arizona State University, who have come together and said, this is important and we want to do something about it. We published an issue of the Hedgehog Review, our journal. Some of you may have picked it up, but this includes some of the essays from some of the leaders who are part of this Moral Ecology Trust. And then in next week, we're publishing a book called The Necessity of Character, Moral Formation and Leadership in Our Time. And that's available on Amazon next week. So, but again, it's these leaders who have come together to say, put a stake in the ground essentially to say, this is an important issue. So leadership is critically important, leadership across all areas of society. Thank you very much.